Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PTRC's 21st Fireside Chat. I'm Shania. I'm the Business Development and Training Manager for PTRC as part of CILT UK. Thank you, everyone, for joining today and registering and sharing the link. Our Fireside Chat series is at our 21st edition, and it's part of an ongoing commitment to fostering meaningful conversations across the transport sector. Today, we will be focusing on the pay per mile road usage. At PTRC, we are passionate about advancing training in transport, and we develop these fireside chats designed to connect professionals, academics, and those that are new to the industry. Before we get started, before I hand over to our expert panel today, just wanted to remind everybody that we are working behind the scenes on the 23rd Annual Transport Practitioners Meeting that will be taking place in July 2026. The deadline for call for papers is next week. So if you are hoping to be part of the programme, please submit an abstract or get in touch with me for further details. Whilst we're at this event, please do put all of your questions and comments into the chat function on YouTube. I will be sharing these with the panel throughout the event, and hopefully you'll be able to get a response. It'll be great to know where everybody's joining us from, so please do let us know where in the world you are accessing this event. I'll now hand over to Glenn Lyons, who is our co-organiser of the Fireside Chat series and our chair for today. Thanks, Glenn.
That's lovely. Thanks, Shania. And Happy New Year, everyone. Yes, my name's Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at the University of the West of England in Bristol in the UK. And welcome back to our Fireside Chat series. Well, with sobering world affairs surrounding us and the festive season not far behind us, you may welcome a little reminder about what prompted this particular Fireside Chat. So here goes. On the 20th of November, following speculation about pay-per-mile charges for motorists in the pending autumn budget, the Secretary of State for Transport was asked about it in the House of Commons. There are no proposals to introduce a national pay-per-mile scheme. This government are firmly on the side of drivers, was her response. It was later explained that this was with reference to any nationwide road pricing scheme for all vehicles. On the 26th of November, the Chancellor set out her autumn budget and said the following: "Because all cars contribute to wear and tear on our roads, I will ensure that drivers are taxed according to how much they drive, not just by the type of car they own, by introducing electric vehicle excise duty on electric vehicles. This will be payable each year alongside vehicle excise duty at 3p per mile for electric cars and 1.5p for plug-in hybrids, helping us to double road maintenance funding in England over the course of this Parliament." On the 26th of November, the government also launched a consultation on the introduction of this so-called EVED, with EVED itself intended to take effect from April 2028. The consultation considers the details of the scheme, and here are a few extracts from the consultation document itself. The government remains firmly committed to supporting the transition to electric vehicles. The government will continue to take steps to ensure the transition to electric is successful, fair, and fiscally sustainable. If left unchanged, this would mean that by 2030, around 1 in 5 car drivers would pay no vehicle duty equivalent, in contrast to other drivers who currently contribute an average of £480 a year. This outcome is not fair to those who've not switched to an EV. The rate of EVED paid by electric vehicle drivers will be half the fuel duty rate paid by the average petrol or diesel driver. Alongside paying their VED each year, under EVED, motorists will estimate their mileage for the year ahead, pay an upfront charge based on their estimate, or spread their payment across the year, and then submit their actual mileage at the end of the year to trigger a reconciliation. Motorists will have their mileage checked annually, typically during their MOT, as is already the case, or for new cars around their first and second registration anniversary. Since the proportion of UK registered cars driving abroad each year is a small proportion of total cars, we'll hear more about this, Anne, in a few moments, it's proportionate to prioritise privacy and simplicity over a system of checks to deduct non-UK mileage. Okay, meanwhile, let's also remind ourselves of the state of play regarding the transition of the UK car fleet to zero tailpipe emissions vehicles. In 2025, battery electric vehicles accounted for 23% of new car registrations in the UK. However, cars last a long time, and while there are now over 1.8 million greenies on our roads, they amount to only about 5% of the total car fleet. There are now over 100,000 public EV charging points in the UK. The transition is happening. In April 2025, reversing a change from the previous administration, the government confirmed that from 2030, pure diesel or petrol-powered new cars will no longer be permitted for sale in the UK. That means going from 46% of new cars sold being pure petrol-powered in 2025 to zero. Sale of new hybrid EVs will be permitted until 2035. Transitions like this tend to start slowly and then accelerate, so it seems possible this dramatic shift in the next few years is achievable. However, this relies on the ongoing scaling up of charging infrastructure, supply availability of new low and zero emission vehicles, and demand from consumers. So to spice things up, why not add into the mix, on top of the recently added annual car tax for EVs, charging 3p per mile for EV use on our roads? In December last year, the UK Parliament's Transport Committee launched an inquiry to consider how effectively the EV transition is progressing and the potential effect of EVED. To complete my roundup of developments, here are two further points to note. On 2nd of January 2026, only a few days ago, the London congestion charge started being applied to EVs for the first time, with pure battery electric vehicles being eligible for a 25% discount. And in December last year, the EU watered down its plans to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles by 2035. Instead of 100% of new vehicles being required to be zero emission by then, this has been reduced to 90%. Parts of the car industry had been complaining that demand for electric vehicles was still too low. Well, as you can see, it's a busy, complex and challenging landscape, nationally and internationally. So is the move to introduce EVED a dose of common sense, or is it playing with fire? Well, to help us explore this further, whether or not we reach any firm conclusions in our conversation, we have an excellent panel to hear from in a moment. And by the way, as Shani has said, please be sure to express your own views as well in the chat bar. Just before that, I would like to give a shout out to Pete Dyson. Hi, Pete, if you're out there. Pete wrote an excellent long-form commentary piece for Local Transport Today in December called "Has Government Begun a New Road Use Charging Era with 3p per mile from EVs?" It's well worth a look. Okay, the waiting's over. Now let's turn to our panel members who've got a huge wealth of experience and expertise to draw upon and who will each provide now their opening thoughts. So Richard, can we please come to you first?
Of course, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for inviting me to the discussion. So just a quick context. My name's Richard Sauno. I am a partner within PA Consulting's transport team. I first embarked on road user charging projects 15 years ago. And at that point, I was very much in favour of the most technologically advanced solution that could achieve all manner of objectives, whether it's revenue collection, congestion management, and all other means. However, in recognition of many countries' fiscal challenges ahead, owing to fuel duty dropping and the increase in zero-emission vehicles, I have widely accepted and seen it as an inevitability that we'll have to introduce some form of per mile charge to electric vehicles, and have written a range of articles and reports over the last 5 years to that point. As a headline, I see introduction of per mile charge on EVs the appropriate, if not inevitable, thing to happen within the UK itself. There is a huge looming deficit with fuel duty going down, and one that government can't really ignore. Further, I think it's quite accepted that those that use roads should contribute to the cost for maintaining them, for which a per mile charge allows for that. Of old, that's always been done through fuel duty. And I see this new EVD as merely an extension of fuel duty. So before we have paid to use the roads through fuel duty for electric vehicles, that doesn't exist as such at the moment. Therefore, pay per use seems eminently fair and merely an extension. I'd further go to add that I think whilst there are many questions posed since the consultation got released and since the announcement, where should it be a different cost for those in rural areas or of different economic means, I see this as the principles that apply to fuel duty can be as simply applied to EVD. Which takes me to the point of simplicity is at the core of making this a success and for it to be understood and for it to be implemented. A few areas that I see as challenges government will need to consider over the, well, probably a few months as well as next few years are around how will they manage the balance of collecting revenue and not negatively impacting the transition to ZEVs? I think they will need to consider whether you're travelling outside of the UK. There's a suggestion within the consultation documents of a digital opt-in solution. I think that is an eminently sensible move. How it's introduced, how it's applied, I think will be tricky and will need some real thought. There needs to be a consideration on tax evasion and odometer tampering. So whilst not many will be looking to purposefully evade this, there will always be a few, and therefore the likes of DVLA, DVSA and others will need to give some real thought to that. And lastly, what I've written in the past is a solution of this nature and a policy of this nature is the foundation for an evolving road tax, so an evolving scheme. I think reading at the odometer is a very sensible approach to start with. I do think that it needs to be designed in a way that can be evolved over time, both to accommodate policy shifts, but also for ease of the customer and consumer. I've a view on all of those areas, but I won't go into all of that, and that I'm no doubt will come out of some of the discussion.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rick. I'm sure it won't have escaped people's notice in the audience that you referred to simplicity being at the core. We might revisit whether or not we feel we're hanging on to simplicity a bit later on, but let's come to Sylvia next, please.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and great to have all of you with us today. I'm Sylvia Barrett. I'm Director of Policy and Research at Campaign for Better Transport. I have worked and researched the issues of road user charging, road pricing, both as a local scheme for managing congestion and pollution, and also as national schemes for the purposes of taxation. So these are two very different points. But at Campaign for Better Transport, we promote and advocate for more sustainable, greener, fairer ways for people to travel, being able to get around by public transport. And of course, electric vehicles are part of the greener transport solution. And we very much support the transition to electric vehicles, which is required for us to reach net zero. But at the same time, cars are still cars, so they do create congestion and pollution for local air quality. So what we are very pleased about is that this scheme not only addresses the fiscal deficit that will be created by the transition to electric vehicles, but it also rebalances the pricing signals in favor of those greener transport modes. Electric vehicles have now started to pay VED, and much as this new scheme has been dubbed EVD, it's actually a replacement for fuel duty rather than addition to VED. So it's good that it operates in a similar way to fuel duty as that it is charged per mile. Now, what we have, but without any sort of additional taxation on electric vehicles, there would have been a risk of EVs eventually being much cheaper to run than petrol and diesel cars, but also compared to public transport. So in that sense, it's good that a scheme is starting to rebalance those sort of transport costs in favor of greener transport options. At Compared for Better Transport, we published a report in 2024, which we called Pay As You Drive. So looking at how we can reform vehicle taxation in order to achieve those dual purposes of promoting sustainable transport, but also plugging that sort of fiscal gap in vehicle taxation. What we found was that both petrol and diesel car drivers, thought that it was only fair that electric vehicle drivers should start to pay taxation in lieu of fuel duty eventually, albeit at a much lower rate than fuel duty. And also electric vehicle drivers did understand that eventually they would need to start paying some form of taxation in lieu of fuel duty. So I think the scheme that has been proposed basically achieves that outcome, and the free P rate is still a lower rate than fuel duty, so as to promote and maintain the incentive of switching to electric vehicles. Of course, many people have raised concerns that this might slow down the transition to electric vehicles, and I'm sure we'll cover that in much more detail in the discussion. But apart from the EVD proposal, there's also lots of other policy decisions that are impacting the transition to electric vehicles, such as the cost of charging, the ZEF mandate and the targets and how we're going to be reaching those, as well as the phase-out date for petrol and diesel vehicles. So there's a lot of things to consider as to how we're going to be maintaining that incentive to switch to EVs. And we can talk about some additional proposals on top of that to maintain that. And of course, there's some technical questions to consider about varying plate weight, or how will is it fair that hybrids pay half the rate, given that the proportion of mileage in electric and petrol mode is not necessarily a 50-50 split, and how would driving abroad will be accounted for. So these are some technical questions that we can think about on how this scheme can work, how it might potentially evolve in future. In my view, it's really good that it's being signaled early and that people can plan for it, and that it's being implemented before electric vehicles reach a critical mass as part of the overall fleet.
That's great. Thank you, Sylvia. And actually, you touched upon something which I admit was taxing my mind a little, which is why are they confusing VED with fuel duty, in the sense that one becomes associated with the extent of use of the network, whereas VED is an ownership-based charge. But and I suppose it touches back upon Richard's challenge of hanging on to simplicity, because the communication of this is going to be critical. And therein lies, innumerable challenges even for us as professionals. But yes, thanks for that. Let's keep moving through our panel, and we'll come back to some of these issues. And thank you to those in the audience who are already bombarding us, I can see, with their own thoughts and questions. Next, we're going to move to Anne, and Anne especially needs to let us know where she is right now, I think, and what she's up to. Please, over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Glenn. And yes, apologies that I'm inside a car. I'm actually south of Lyon, having travelled back from Italy. I no longer fly, having done carbon literacy project training myself several years ago. So we now travel around Europe on the odd holiday in a Tesla. So I'm actually at a supercharger site just south of Lyon, and charging talking to you while we charge. As I've just said, I'm Anne Snelson. I'm a carbon literacy project trainer, and that means that I tell people within the transport and automotive sectors all about climate change, where we are, and what we need to do. Prior to that, I've had 35 years in a mixture of communications, research, marketing, most of that within the transport sector. So that's my background to it. I did start out, my second job was actually as a policy researcher in the AA in the 1990s, early 1990s, where one of my projects was road pricing. I have to say I wasn't the expert writing it, but I was a support to that. So in some ways, I'm quite glad that maybe 30 years on, we're getting slightly closer to delivering what we originally looked at there. I have to say that many of the problems that we identified in the early 90s are still there today. In terms of how do we do this fairly and equitably. And at that time, of course, we were looking not just at electric vehicles, but road pricing for every type of vehicle. As a carbon literacy project trainer, my main focus, of course, is what do we do about climate change? We're already at 1.5 degrees centigrade above and pre-industrial levels. And indeed, it's been confirmed that 2025 was again the UK's hottest ever. And that, of course, is hottest ever, on top of hottest ever, on top of hottest ever. So we need to do something about this. And transport is the biggest sector for domestic emissions within the UK. Around the world, it's the second biggest. And obviously, the biggest thing that we can do is to electrify and also move, as Sylvia said, to public transport, to more sustainable transport, walking, cycling, etc. So from my point of view, adding 3 pence per mile just for electric vehicles, I understand why we're doing it, but the last thing I want is for it to actually damage the shift to electric vehicles, which is something that we crucially need. And I think people have to understand that that's what we have to do. We've seen previously, when Rishi Sunak has stood up and said people can't afford an electric vehicle, the percentage sales of electric vehicles have dropped almost within days of that happening. And those drops can be significant. And at the moment, we are doing pretty well. We are shifting 23% last year. Around 25% now of new sales are electric vehicles. And in my opinion, we need to do even more of that. While we're doing well in the UK, we're not doing as well as many other countries around the world. Scandinavia, obviously, Norway, 98%. In many months, they are not selling petrol and diesel cars anymore. China, 50%. Nepal, even 70% of vehicles being sold there are electric. And I would far prefer that we were up with those sorts of levels. And in many ways, we should be. We have the ZEV mandate, which we are the first country in the world to have produced targets and set deadlines for the transfer from petrol and diesel to electric. I think that's a fabulous thing for us to have done. I do work with many suppliers and manufacturers within the UK, and those that I work with certainly are doing their utmost to achieve those targets and do everything they can because they understand the need to do it too. So basically, on the back of that, yes, I think that most of my EV driver friends, the people that I know that I work with, completely understand why this is being introduced. I think most of them also agree that it is only fair that they pay towards road building, road maintenance, hopefully a bit better charging network across the UK, perhaps some more public transport, cycleways and walking routes as well. My big concern really is, how do we make this fair for everybody? How do we continue that transfer to electric vehicles without this damaging it anymore? We have quite a negative media here, and I think that this will only make it worse. And as I think it was Graham said, how do we stop people clocking cars? Because that's the road safety risk. At the moment, where apparently about 2% of cars in the UK show signs of clocking, and that's the highest in Europe. So that would be my other big concern too.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. I can't resist before I move on to Graham, just asking you for a brief reflection on the fact that you're clocking up international miles and you're going to be paying 3p for each of those. Do you have any idea how much this trip would have cost you if it was in 2028?
Well, we're doing about 2,000 miles, and I have to say it's my lovely partner's electric vehicle. I gave up mine a few years ago, as you know, Glenn. So yeah, in some ways I feel a bit of a fraud. So I mean, 2,000 miles at 3 pence per mile, what, 30 pound, 60 pounds, something like that. So yes, it would be more. But I would also say that it's there should be fuel duty on aeroplanes as well, but we can go into that one another day.
Just as we were trying to keep it simple. Thank you, Anne. That's great. Graham, can we move on to you, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Glenn. So Graham Parkhurst, I'm Professor of Sustainable Mobility at the University of the West of England and Centre for Transport and Society, that is. I began my career as an academic researcher in transport studies in 1991, and I've been interested in transport taxation and the regulation of motoring ever since. In 2002, I published a book chapter which argued essentially that with the evolution of powertrains, something like road user charging would become inevitable because of the problem of replacing fuel duty. And then a few years later, 2005, I co-authored a journal article with Stephen Potter, then at the Open University, which again suggested that a distance-based charge would be a simple way of introducing road user charging, and also be one that would discourage further dispersal of development and suburbanization, which might occur were you to charge congestion-based charging at high rates in city centres. So 20 years on, when the 3P announcement came out, I was almost surprised at myself reacting rather negatively to the idea. The reason really is around this concept of fairness, which we've mentioned in some contexts, but I wanted to dig into this a bit more in my short piece. I think it's a reflection really on the difference between theory and practice and what I've learned about the EV transition over recent years. So one thing to bear in mind, I think, is that, you know, compared to typical domestic consumption of electricity, EVs need a lot of power. So typical domestic consumption is around 7 kilowatt hours a day. That's enough to drive an electric car about 25 miles. So in a single EV in an average household is likely to double the electricity consumption of that household just on a small daily commute of 12.5 miles each way. So energy costs do really matter, alongside all the other things like reliability and stability of charging arrangements. So back at the beginning of the millennium, it also wasn't clear to me how important having private parking adjacent to the dwelling was going to be. And also combining that with some degree of control over the electricity tariff. You can see where this is going now, I think. So we've ended up in a situation that, partly due to the particular characteristics of the UK energy market, some people can charge their cars for 7 pence a kilowatt hour overnight. Other people going to the local supermarket might be paying a typical rate of 70 pence per kilowatt hour. And that, by the way, already includes 20% VAT plus government levies, which are there to pay for the energy sector transition. So in other words, in case of a home charger, running costs can be as low as 2 pence per mile. And for those using a public charger, on that 70 pence, that'll be more like 20 pence per mile. That's actually a higher figure, that public charger figure, than it is for petrol and diesel cars, which are about 17 pence per mile. But of course, that's a really wide average. Yet one of the best non-plug-in hybrids, and you could actually achieve 75 miles per gallon with a light foot. That would cost you about 9 pence per mile. So 3p on top of the EV charge for those people who are paying 20p per mile pushes it to 23 and increases those differentials between electric vehicles and the other options further. And it comes, of course, as we've mentioned, on top of applying the vehicle excise duty to vehicles, electric vehicles last year. And the fundamental problem here in terms of fairness is that the political logic seems to have in mind the typical early adopter with a home charging solution, an overnight tariff, who only very occasionally uses the public charging network. And when they do, it could be on their employer's business. And actually, if you look at the views of this kind of driver on social media, it's almost hands up saying, this was too good to last. They finally caught up with us. It's only fair. But actually, I don't, would we really consider charging petrol a tenfold difference between neighbours as a fair solution. So the wider context here, national policy is that all households will eventually be using electric vehicles, whether or not they can home charge. Will it always be 3p? Will it be more? What is it going to mean for the value of their properties and the desirability of those properties if they can't home charge? To go back to the book chapter of 2002, the overall book, actually co-edited by Glenn Lyons and others, was around the fuel tax protests of 2000. An event that actually caused Tony Blair to disengage from transport policy altogether, never mind road pricing. The causes were complex, but it reminds us that this is a very politically volatile context. One of the triggers then was the big rise in world crude oil prices, something the government didn't have any control of. In this case, they do have control. I mean, some things may go in their favour. It's not clear that the overnight cheap tariffs will last as we move through the transition. More and more people will use them. You may see that trough disappear of overnight cheap rates. But even at domestic rates, there's going to be, the standard rates of about 25, 30p a kilowatt hour. There's still going to be an important differential. And we know research recently for Charge UK has identified one of the key reasons is the very high network costs for chargers. So this is what the charging point operators have to pay in order to connect to the network. In effect, what we're doing is expecting the current users to pay for the development of the charger network, particularly the high-speed chargers on, for top-up charging. So I would say yes, in principle, to distance-based charging, but not in practice until the failures in the electricity market have been sorted, which could radically alter that fairness balance between those with and without home charging options. If that can't be done, then there needs to be some mechanism to redistribute some of these costs between people who have home charging and those don't. Otherwise, it won't fail it will fail the basic fairness test in the consultation document.
That's fantastic, Graham. Thanks for such a fact and insight-rich introduction. And kind of I find myself looping back to what Richard had said at the start, in the sense that there's something about the mirroring of fuel duty that's compelling, but what you've done here is kind of pulled at a thread that starts to unravel that and highlight that we're not actually on the same page yet, and far from it. So the plot thickens, I suppose. Melanie, I'm sure you're going to make things sound much more straightforward. I'm being sarcastic, of course. What would you like to offer us up in your introductory remarks? Oh, you're on mute, Melanie.
Sorry. Hello. Yes, I think a lot of what Graham said totally resonates with my thoughts. I might sort of have a slightly different angle on it, but broadly agree with that. But first of all, hello. Thanks for having me. I'm Melanie Shuttlebotham. I'm the co-founder of ZapMap, which we set up in 2014, really with the mission of helping people that make the shift from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars. So enabling a low carbon future, but also a good air quality as well. And the part that we play within that is really around public charging. So our driver focus app helps EV drivers find and pay for charging across the extensive public network. But we also track the market. So we've got a lot of market data tracking the growth and the profile and the utilization and the pricing on the public charging network. And we work with lots of people across the industry, including providing data to the government and others. So really my angle on this really is about very much thinking about what we can do to continue with the really good progress that has already happened within this huge transition that we're making. It's 30% of all of our emissions, and we are making this amazing shift. Renewable energy have done a lot of the heavy lifting in the last 10 years, but really the shift to EVs, the Committee for Climate Change it has that as the number one thing that consumers can do in order to really shift the dial in the next 5 years and up to 2035. So I think where we should be pleased. I slightly disagree with Anne in that I think the UK has done pretty well. We're since 2014, when I started in this market, when there was about 5 or 6 models, there are now over 100 models available. The average range on new cars has shifted from around 100 miles to over 300 miles. The charging infrastructure, whilst still it obviously needs to grow as the EV park grow, is really pretty extensive now across all the charging uses. It's not just one use case. Chargers for en route charging, chargers to support destination charging, so charging while you stop. And then, of course, a really important area, a local level charging to support those quite a large number of people who don't have off-street parking. And when people get into EVs, they are overwhelmingly satisfied with their EVs, and satisfaction with EVs it runs higher than satisfaction with ICE, petrol and diesel cars. And numerous studies have shown that only around 3% would actually shift back. So, this is really overall a good news story. There are headwinds, which I might have a chance to go into later, but in terms of framing it. And I think with regard to the three pence per mile, first of all, to me, it was quite out of the blue within this overall UK policy framework to sort of lob in this 3 pence per mile. But of course, EV drivers understand and know that they have to contribute to road usage. I mean, that would be silly if they didn't think that. But I think there are 2 points I'd like to make. One is very much along the same lines as Graham, in that paying for EVs is much more complicated than paying for ICE. It's not just about getting some electricity, it's where you get the electricity from. And there's a huge divide between those people who are able to charge at home and those who are not able to charge at home. I won't go through that again, but I agree with what Graham said. And I think the point is that EV drivers are already paying tax. So when you're charging on the public network, of which there are 4 million charging sessions every single month, they are paying 20% VAT, which equates to around 3 pence a mile already. So there are market failures elsewhere that need to be addressed alongside some kind of, I'm not against per se a pence per mile figure, but it needs to be alongside pulling down the cost of public charging, whether that's standing, the standing charges, whether that's getting into the RTFO, and then more broadly, reform of the overall electricity market, so we don't have the highest electricity cost within the UK, which is of course within the EU, which of course is a broader point, but it very much links into electric vehicles. And then I think in parallel, we should not be shying away to continue to increase the tax on petrol and diesel cars. To me, I understand the sort of political reality of why we've frozen fuel duty, and I'm pleased to see that's being unfrozen. But that is the estimated cost of 100 billion of lack of tax take since 2011. So that's all about the home versus non-home charging and how we need to make sure that the tax is definitely taxing the ICE cars as well. And I think the second point is more broad. It's about timing. So whilst the transition has got a lot of momentum, we're in a good place at the moment. Or in fact, the UK is arguably in the top 3 or 4 of larger economies in terms of market uptake. And we have a positive policy framework in the UK. It is strange to bring this policy in just when we're trying to get across that chasm. So going from 23% market share up to 30% market share. We need to make sure that we continue to have positive messages and supporting that shift, and not getting sort of other messages coming into the market, which can and do cut through and are taken up by our very vociferous press, as it's a very easy headline for people to make.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melanie. I've been scribbling madly, and the audience clearly has got more intense with its own thoughts and questioning rather than calming down. But we're not quite complete. So, Steve, would you like to complete the set for us with your opening remarks?
Yes, Glenn, thanks very much. I'm Steve Gooding. These days, I'm the director of the RAC Foundation. 22 years ago, I was the roads director in the Department for Transport, and it's 22 years since I was introduced to the fabulous world of road pricing in all its incarnations. 5 years after that, I emerged blinking back into the daylight, and I carry with me, a bit like Graham was carrying with him some thoughts on my conclusions at the time. When I left that role, I came away with a couple of things very clear in my mind. One is there's no such thing as a simple approach to dealing with an issue that's the product of 40 million people exercising their ability to use 30 million vehicles. It's going to be complicated, whatever you do. This is difficult stuff. Public policy that affects millions of people in what they do every day is always going to be difficult, and it's always going to be contentious. And partly because of that, my second conclusion at the time, and I think I've been proven right, is that for all of the other ambitions that academics and economists might have for this tool we loosely call road user charging or road pricing, the single standout compelling one is a way of raising money for the Treasury. So let's not be in any doubt. What the government announced on the 26th of November last year was a device for raising money for the Treasury to spend on stuff. Now I'm going to point out here that although in what the Chancellor said and other ministers have said subsequently, there have been some fairly loose reflections on how everyone using the roads is contributing to wear and tear on the roads. This is not about recreating a road fund licence. The road fund licence was effectively undermined by Winston Churchill in 1926 and disposed of by Neville Chamberlain in 1937. We do not have a road fund licence in this country. What we have is motorists paying tax to the Treasury, and the Chancellor then decides what to spend that money on. And that's what this is about. Be in no doubt, there are policy ambitions that can be attached to it, and it's certainly the case that the government has tried hard. We will all have a view on how successful they've been, but they have tried hard not to undermine and perhaps to enforce, to accelerate some other policy ambitions they've got about the transition to zero emission motoring. But what we're talking about is a way of raising money for the Treasury out of motoring. I would make just one other observation, and that is some of us who have been involved in this debate, I would say, on and off, certainly in my case, for over 20 years, for Richard and Graham, probably nearer 40 years. And that's the government has announced its intention to do something, and we all get that. And I think in many ways we all feel almost a sense of relief. We felt this was coming, and now they've announced what they're going to do. This would not be the first time that the government had announced its intention to do something, and then for some other reason not quite got round to doing it. And I can think of no better way to terrify the politicians into backing away from this than to start discussing how this revenue-raising measure for the Treasury, which they have designed to be as simple as it can be in the circumstances, could be made more complicated, even if it's more complicated in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years' time. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen because it is the, on the one hand, simplest, but nevertheless practicable and politically deliverable thing that can be done. Otherwise, this won't happen either.
Thank you, Steve. I think that was quite a good dose of common sense there. Well, from all of you, that was an absolutely fantastic deluge of insights and perspectives. Some of the thoughts that came to me were included, well, Richard's point, you said, Richard, appropriate if not inevitable. And I do remember back in the days when Steve was in the DFT, there was talk of the inevitability of road pricing in the public's mind. Why on earth otherwise would government say the words road pricing if it wasn't going to do it? And I certainly noted, looking at the consultation document, that it seems to make clear this is about the detail. It's not about whether or not we're going to do this. And it seems to me you have a choice. If you say to the public and to industry, we might do this, what do you think and how would you suggest we do it? This conversation has illustrated beautifully that you would never go anywhere with that. So my sense is that there's been a very sensible approach taken, which is we've got a plan, this is how we're going to do it. And yes, we know the devil's in the detail, but this is going to happen. And I suppose, Steve, back to you, one of your closing points, it does seem to be a classic case of government is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, because to not do something at this point would seem like madness, at least in retrospect, once the transition, if it continues, has fully matured, and we have even more tightening of the public purse in terms of what we can spend on stuff, as you put it. What I would like to ask, we've got some various points from the audience, but I would just like to get a general sense from you all as a recap. Do you think, on balance, this is a dose of common sense that government has delivered to us all, or is it playing with fire? And I'm open to any of you who'd like to jump in first to give a reaction to that, but it would be nice to get a quick fire view from around the group. You've given some quite strong hints in your opening remarks. Who'd like to jump in first? Steve.
Glenn, I'm happy to jump in because you and I've discussed this before in a way. And is it playing with? It's going to be playing with fire because everything that affects quite so many, let's face it, voters, is playing with fire. So we have to be clear about that. What I would say is there's nothing cast in stone that says that motoring has to be a net contributor to the exchequer. But since it is, and since we all were pretty clear this government, like every other, was going to keep it so, I think it is good to have a sense of this is how it's going to be done. And I think one of the other folks on the panel said, people need to have some ability to plan ahead, to have a sense of what is going to be driving their household costs in 4, 5, 6 years' time. So I think in that sense, it's common sense to do the right thing or get off the pot on this and just tell us what is the plan. Now, at least we've got a sense of what the Treasury plan is.
I can see you nodding, Sylvia. Are you on the side of common sense with this one?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's the on balance, it's sort of the most sensible approach we could take at this point because for two reasons. One, it's that it's better to introduce it sort of earlier rather than later before obviously more people are affected who have already purchased electric vehicles, as I said. But also it's signaling that it is obviously only applying to electric vehicle drivers. It's not applying to all the millions of drivers across the UK. So again, it's affecting a small proportion of drivers who expected to start paying tax at some point in any case. And that goes back to my point about why it's being called EVD. I see that as a signal that we're not touching fuel duty. We're not going to be affecting petrol and diesel drivers with this proposition. So yes, it's sensible, but we do need to address lots of other policy and costing implications for electric vehicle drivers, as we have been discussing.
Thank you. And maybe I'll stick on what I think is this side of the fence as I'm looking at you all. Richard, I think you would perhaps generally seeing this as the dose of common sense, but any comments on playing with fire?
You're absolutely right. I entirely agree. I think it's common sense. I think your reflection on how the consultation document is pitched, I completely agree with. It is almost this is going to happen. Here are some of the finer details. I think the playing with fire will be how they work through and communicate the finer details, because there are some the happy path for someone that is willing to pay and doesn't sell their vehicle or buy new vehicles on a monthly basis or doesn't travel outside of the UK. All of these factors, the happy path is an easy one to design a solution for. If they, at the point at which they start looking at those more nuanced cases, then it does become more complicated. And I think that is when you start playing with fire a little more, because it becomes very real.
Okay, and I'm looking at Melanie Ann and Graham. I'm not entirely going to prejudge, but I think you might be more aware of the how much the fire can burn fingers at this point in the transition. Melanie, would you like to have a reaction to that first, and then perhaps Anne and Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be anti, and I'm certainly not anti EV drivers contributing tax, but I think my 2 points is I'm concerned on, there's already a concern on the equity of this transition in terms of cost. I mean, at least second-hand cars are now coming onto the market, but there's a cost issue. and this issue between no home charging and home charging. There's already a penalty that those without home charging pay in terms of convenience and cost, and this will add to it. And then I think the second point is now the time. I'm not convinced when we're at quite a critical time in the UK, but also within the international context of all the stuff that's going on, sort of in the anti-climate rhetoric.
Thanks, Melanie. Anne.
Yeah, similar to Melanie, as you guessed. I mean, I'm not anti it per se. I would far prefer that, dare I say, diesel and petrol vehicles were included in this as well. You know, if we're talking fairly in terms of what's creating emissions, what's creating damage to roads, etc., then you should include heavier vehicles, you know, all sorts of other things in it, and maybe those will happen in due course. I would prefer something that is basically one sort of taxation across everybody, and based on mileage, you know, because we should also be looking at how do we persuade people to think about their transport usage. Says me a little hypocritically, having driven across Europe, but you know, that's what we should be getting people to consider, and a pence per mile for everyone, with, dare I say, more on petrol and diesel cars, would at least then give a better playing field for what we want to achieve, in my opinion.
Thanks, Anne. And Graham, I don't know whether you can possibly give us two views. The 2002 Graham, what would he be saying right now if he'd heard this news from the future? And what does the Graham of the present say?
I think the past view would be, yes, good to have a simple scheme. Maybe this is a little bit too simple, designed for people who are used to filling in tax returns and the like, and not for the people who normally don't think about their car ownership, just turn up and fill up the tank. My current view, as I think I made fairly clear, is that we are underestimating how hard it's going to be to move from the early adopters, for whom EVs are the natural, obvious choice, to those people who wouldn't have chosen this. Currently, they're fairly open-minded, but this could really tip the balance for them, particularly if it's going to make life more complicated. And there's significant potential for forces which are against the EV transition for other reasons to capture this debate and this to become a lightning rod for it.
Thanks, Graham. Steve, you made, I think, a very important point about purpose here. And in your view, it's very clear this is about Treasury and generating a revenue stream to support being able to spend on stuff. My sense was that this is, as much as anything, about establishing the principle of EV drivers paying something. And I see in the chat the comments from the audience, various comments about why are we not including a weight-based element to this, since that could also be done in line with the MOT on an annual basis. And indeed, someone else was asking about international comparator countries that have gone down a similar route. New Zealand, I know Richard's highlighted, I had some experience being over there myself many years ago. Ironic for New Zealand, who like to be a fast follower for years and can't quite see why it's so remarkable that you would raise revenue to support maintenance of the very network that the vehicles are relying on for going about their business economically and socially. So I'd just like to come to this point about, is this fundamentally about establishing the principle? And if so, what principles being established? Is it that Treasury needs income? Is it that we need to address the climate emergency? Is it that we're needing all vehicles to be recognising their contribution to demands on the network, including congestion, although we've not referred to congestion charging? Where do you see this sitting? And Steve, perhaps I'll come back to you first in terms of this issue of what the principle is behind this, the purpose.
Well, I think the principle is actually very clear. It is that there's a Treasury orthodoxy that once you've established a form of tax, you preserve that form of tax. The first principle of creating taxation systems is to have a broad base of tax sources. So you don't want everything loaded onto, say, income tax, or everything loaded onto property tax. You want lots of different taxes bringing in money in lots of streams. the Treasury in this country has got very used over a number of years to having a lovely rich stream of money coming in from a thing called fuel duty, and what it desperately wanted was to replace that rich stream of money coming in from fuel duty with something from motoring, because the orthodoxy is motoring has been making this £27 billion contribution to the exchequer, and it should carry on doing so. Now, it should carry on doing so in a way, preferably, that doesn't undermine other policies and perhaps helps accelerate them, but that's what it is, and that's very clear. You raise other countries that have been down this path. There's New Zealand, there's Iceland, there's a couple of American states, there's Hawaii. Interestingly, these tend to be places that don't have land borders. Let's not forget Northern Ireland here. And they tend to have systems which are as simple as they can possibly be. There are other policy initiatives and imperatives that they pursue, but they don't load them onto that simple, straightforward. You're going to drive some miles. We're going to charge you for the miles you drive. That's it. After you've got that working, the other thing I would say about an effective tax system is it's boring. We don't spend much of our time discussing most taxes because they're just there and they tick along. We might not like them, but we don't debate them. I think if I was working in the Treasury, I'd be aiming for something that is as boring and simple as possible.
And Richard, is this boring enough for you? I know you'd said your earlier thinking had been you wanted kind of a bells and whistles because technology is perfectly capable, as most of us know, of doing time, distance, place-based and weight-based charging for how we use roads. Are you happy this is establishing a principle and is probably as far as it should have gone at this stage?
So, yes. I think this sets the foundation for, in Steve's words, the most boring that they could have pushed. And with that, I think it's probably the most cost-effective way of introducing something. It's probably the easiest to be understood, and it's probably the easiest to capture. So from my perspective, I think this is absolutely well, again, the inevitable first choice of how they would set up a scheme. Now, that's not to say that in future years, this couldn't become a platform that does start to vary a rate based on weight, based on size, because all those aspects are feasible. We have vehicle classes, captured within DVSA, DVLA databases, which is where all of this will need to be run through. So the feasibility of doing that is there. I think the interesting thing for Treasury and for government will be at what pace would they want to move and with what objective. So it's very clear this is solely a revenue generating tax. It is not around congestion and all those other facets that we know road user charging can be used effectively for.
Thanks, Richard. I'll come to you in a moment, Sylvia, just as a kind of further point on principle, and then I'd like to turn to Melanie Ann and Graham on this bigger question of the transition that's underway. But with regard to principle, it seems to me that inadvertently, since the beginning of many of our careers, we started off focusing on the problem of car dependence, on the notion of tackling, if not solving, congestion. And suddenly we find ourselves distracted from that in many ways, preoccupied by removing tailpipe emissions from vehicles, and that being our primary concern. Are you worried that we might be establishing here a form of principle, simple though it hopes to be, that further shuts down the prospect of tackling car dependence and rebalancing the way society gains access to what things people need?
Not necessarily. I think there are obviously both pros and cons to what is on the table right now. One of the benefits is that this new tax will be much more visible than fuel duty currently is, because fuel duty is hidden within the price that we pay at the pump, whereas this would be a clearer sort of sense of how much you're paying for usage. So someone asked in the question in the chat about whether this can sort of help people reduce the overall mileage that they drive, and potentially it could. So there is research that shows in Scandinavian countries, in Norway, for example, in the absence of a per mile charge, the adoption of electric vehicles has led to an increase of people, the amount of driving people doing electric vehicles by about 10 to 20% compared to their prior usage. So I think this sort of visible tax can help mitigate that impact, that rebound effect of switching towards an EV. And if you're able to charge obviously at home, it risks being much cheaper than other modes. So you would then use it more. I think ideally, from a principle perspective, you might think that you might want a similar visible tax to replace fuel duty. But as I said, I don't think there's a prospect of this happening anytime soon because it's a much bigger, much more controversial undertaking if you were to sort of replace a whole system of taxation. Fuel duty is a very sort of easy tax for the Treasury to collect. It's been described as a perfect tax. I think as long as EVD is coupled with a return to inflation-raised increases to fuel duty, the differential will be maintained between petrol and electric vehicles. We must, of course, address the separate issue of public versus home charging. And I think whether you're being charged 3p per mile for usage, that's a completely separate issue that obviously we need to tackle that separately.
Thanks. And your points actually make me think about perhaps the importance of being clearer about a hierarchy of devil in the detail, because I think that the danger I see now is that we mix together a multitude of things, and actually some of those are sort of fundamental in Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you like, to both the transition but also to making this scheme work, and others are higher up. They're nice to worry about issues but aren't in the same category. So perhaps that's something that, at least for me, that comes from this. Melanie, you've made some thoughts clear already, but if we were to see this very quickly become a boring yesterday's news, 3p per mile, do you see that it has the prospect of being seen as something incidental to the EV transition, or are you still fundamentally worried it could be an instrumental roadblock? And perhaps you could add a bit more colour to that. You know, how could things go wrong in terms of the UK's transition if this doesn't play out well? Oh, you're on mute again, Melanie.
Sorry, you'd think I'd learn. But yeah, I mean, as I said before, we have got a positive policy framework overall within the UK. We've got the ZEV mandate, we've got the 2030/2035 ban, we've got demand side measures in terms of salary sacrifice, the electric car grant, and we've got a lot of support for charging infrastructure rollout and for home charging. So overall, it is a pretty good policy framework, and the government is absolutely saying, this is what we want to do. However, there are some headwinds, and I would say that this is not going to be huge, but it could shift perceptions. And whilst EV drivers are overwhelmingly positive about EVs, when you ask people who have not yet shifted to EVs, they have quite a different perception. They're concerned about the upfront costs. They're not looking at overall cost of ownership. They're concerned about the charging infrastructure, which, clearly charging infrastructure is not positive, but I think people will be surprised at how extensive it is across the UK, and the perception is much worse for those people who don't have an EV than those who do. People are concerned about batteries, and there's a lot of concerns that people have, some of which is very valid concerns that people are thinking about going to a new technology, and some of it is very much fueled by a negative framing within the press. And my concern on this is another element that's quite easy. It's quite easy to understand, which is both good and bad, because it's very easy for the press to get hold of it and have headlines like EVs much more expensive to run than petrol cars. And if people hear that message repeatedly, even if it is true in a very minority of cases, that is going to put off people. And to get from where we are now, around 24% of new cars being pure electric, to the 80% ZEV mandate by 2030, which in fact will probably be at around 60% once you've taken into account flexibilities, that is around 5 million people who need to shift over. And there are 5 million people who are broadly keen on it. But what we don't want is sort of the mood to shift because of these sort of lurid headlines, I guess. But overall, I am confident electric cars are better. They're better technically. They're better for the environment. They're overall more cost effective, and just much easier to maintain, etc., etc. So they are a better solution, and this is where we're going. So I've got no worries that the transition is not going to happen, but I do have some worries that this will add to the sort of noise, which is not a positive thing.
And they're coming to you, Anne, I suppose they're better and getting better, but also there's been reference already to average figures. And it seems to me that no one out there is average. And there's a good chance that many of the later adopters may have lower mileage, or there will be many people with lower mileage, and therefore their problem remains one of acquiring an EV in the first place, rather than necessarily worrying unduly about the sum of money monthly or annually that this EVED will present to them. Do you have any sense, if you can look beyond, I mean, I think it's fair to say you're an example of an early adopter traveling across Europe in your Tesla. Not everyone's doing that right now. In terms of your carbon literacy training and the different context you've seen for people, do you have any views about the wider reception that might come to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Melanie is saying, EV drivers love their EVs. Let's be clear about this. Once you've transferred and you've got used to it and you've made that shift, then the vast majority of people really like quieter, cleaner, low emission driving. But it is those people that are yet to shift. I mean, there's a hardcore, the EVA England research suggests that there's a hardcore of about 40% of people who say that they will never buy an EV. These sorts of measures are not helping that. And if there was some alternative to, if electricity were cheaper, as it was 3-4 years ago when I used to work for Co-Charge and neighborhood charging, there were all sorts of reasons that people would swap. There were solutions in place, coming into place, where people could share chargers and could benefit from that much cheaper charging at home. And maybe we will still get there, but what we do need is far more people to actually be making that shift, to be thinking, yep, this is definitely what I want to do. My next car will be an EV, we'll be planning for it. And just the constant negative headlines from the media, EV growth is faltering, here's another reason not to get an EV. That's not helping at all. So I think, like Melanie, I'm worried about the timing. We sort of seem to see growth, increase in EVs as we announce the ZEV mandate, and everyone says, yep, we're definitely going for EVs. And then, there are things brought in to make that harder. I actually feel quite sorry for the suppliers, the manufacturers, OEMs, because this change in policy constantly, yeah, we're absolutely going for it, and then we're not. Other things being put in place makes it really hard for them, and makes it hard for them to plan that shift. And I see that frustration with the people that I train. So I would like a clear policy. And I guess on the size of vehicles, if we're talking about actual emissions here, there was an estimate, wasn't there, that this could cut the uptake of EVs by 8% by 2035. That would mean an extra 4 million tons of carbon dioxide between now and 2035. So these are serious things that could potentially impact where we're going and how much cost of living crisis, etc., is going to increase as well.
Yeah, and I suppose your point there about potential impacts on EV uptake may or may not take account of some of the points Melanie made, which is that EVs continue to get better in terms of range, battery quality and life and so on. So the deal is more and more attractive. But Graham, I perhaps want to come back to you on continuing the issue of fairness with points you made in your introduction about the disparity between those who've got a private driveway. I have to say I'm in that category of thinking this is the best thing since sliced bread. I'm paying 7p. It cost me about £5 to charge our electric vehicle. And as someone who works flexibly and does less miles than I used to in the old days, what's not to like? But if you flipped me into that world you described, of paying 10 or 14 times more each week, I think my mood might change quite quickly.
Yeah, and I think you have to consider also that, as Steve says, if the objective is to replace taxation, then 3p is only the start. If you look at the cost of fuel duty and the associated VAT on selling liquid fuel, you're talking about 80p a litre, which would translate to about 10 pence per mile if you wanted to replace the entire tax take based on the average current ICE vehicle. So it would have to go 3 times higher, and that would be 50% increase in the current costs of public charging. So 30 pence a mile to run your EV. I just feel this is not going to be sustainable politically. And what will then happen is there will be pushback. We might see the Labour Party deciding that it's unfair on working people in traditional terraced house environments where it's extremely hard to arrange home charging. There are some proposals now with cross pavement solutions, but they can only really work for the occasional house, particularly if there's a mobility impaired person in the house and you can justify a painted bay outside that house. And there can be, no doubt, some improvements. But I think when you're out there using the public infrastructure, yes, many times it works perfectly. The problem is finding the chargers that don't work. Somebody's cut the cable. How many times did you turn up to a petrol station and were really unlucky to find that the tanker delivery was just happening, so the petrol station was closed? It's probably a once or twice in a lifetime experience. I think if you're using the public charging network, then you would encounter currently some disadvantages and difficulties with chargers being out of action. And I know we can do this better and it will get better. But I just feel there needs to be something there in the decision-making process to overcome those teething difficulties in the transition. And that needs to be a cost incentive. And I think for people who are going to be particularly in the second-hand market that haven't got their vehicles on salary sacrifice, then the actual cost per mile to use the vehicle needs to be attractive.
I'd like to thank you, Graham. I'd like to come back to, I think, Melanie, you made the point about media interest in this. I'm reminded of the story about Ken Livingstone when he introduced congestion charging in London, that, as I understand it, famously, this was the one policy measure upon which all his advisors were agreed, which was unusual. They were all agreed he shouldn't do it. And he did it anyway, and he did it simply, didn't go down a technologically complex route, but he also did it within very swiftly to be fitted within his term of office. He had included it in his manifesto. So I'm wondering, in terms of where we're at now with this, whether there's a challenge in how we communicate to the public. First of all, in terms of impressing upon them that this is unavoidably a complex issue. We're in the midst of a fundamental regime transition in how we propel our vehicles, the 30 million plus that we rely upon. It would seem madness to try and pretend this is simple and straightforward. And indeed, are we not caught in the crosshairs almost potentially of the media, where if they were listening to this, they'd say, well, look, even the experts can't fully agree. They're going off in all directions. So what hope can there really be that this is a sensible thing to do? And we can certainly find one of them who will speak on our behalf and create a sensationalist headline. So really, I'm wanting to come to messaging to the public. I mean, if you happen to be in a public service broadcasting moment now, speaking to the wider UK population, how might you present your thoughts on sticking with this? And, accepting the detail might be wrinkled and messy, but in the round, it's a good thing. Would anyone like to pitch in on that to start with? Steve, I know you appear sometimes in the media, as indeed Anne and others do. If this were your moment right now, what would you be saying?
So are you asking me to pitch my opinion or the government's position? I'm quite familiar with doing each.
Well, why don't you pitch and we'll tell you which one we think it was.
Well, I think I've written a lot of lines to take in my time, and I would start, I think, by saying, look, this is terribly clear. and it's terribly straightforward. All we're asking people to do is pay a very modest sum of money for the miles they drive. We're going to make this as light touch as we possibly can by asking them to report how many miles they're driving. And in once a year, just once a year, that number's going to be checked. Couldn't really be simpler than that, could it?
Perfect. Anne, do you want to add to that or polish it or get off for a different view? If you're now in front of the 30 million plus motorists, eagerly awaiting a view from an expert.
Well, interesting that possibly I wouldn't make this the public announcement. I think Steve did a fabulous job there of selling it into the public. But the interesting thing is that actually that annual payment, or even splitting it down over monthly payments, means that people don't actually think about it nearly as much. I mean, I saw from at Ringo, I did analyses of parking sessions and parking permits. People would pay once a year, actually just take it as part of their overlying costs and just see it as a sunk cost. If you change the price that you are paying every day and you make a step change in that, people will start to think about what they are doing. And so in many ways, if we could separate out that fuel duty, I mean, the 3p per mile in many ways does make people think about how far they're traveling, whereas we're not getting that for petrol and diesel drivers. I would like that to be very clear for them as well about what their costs are. So I can see quite well why the government is doing what they are doing. But actually, if we want this to have a positive impact in terms of making people think about how far they're traveling, how far they need to travel, back to Sylvia's point, potentially maybe EV drivers do drive further, then we should be actually trying to get everyone onto that 3p per mile, or dare I say even more for petrol and diesel drivers, so that they understand that by switching to an electric vehicle, they're actually going to reduce their costs.
And Melanie, you're in a sense, ZapMap is set up as a public service of sorts to, as you mentioned earlier, to help enable more people to join the transition. Do you have views as an organisation, or back to yourself as an individual, about the role you would wish to play in terms of public communication around this new twist in the transition story?
Yeah, I mean, I have communicated that what ZapMap has a price index which tracks the cost of rapid, ultra rapid, home charging, slower charging, and we have a number of profiles of EV drivers, so we can calculate, what a typical EV driver would pay. And that is based on research on charging profiles. So our typical profile is John and Rosa, who charge 80% at home on a 7 or 8p tariff, and then 20% on the high-powered networks that are paying sort of 76p, I think it is. And when you calculate out that comes out at 6p per mile, compared to an average ICE vehicle of around 14p per mile. So 12 to 14p per mile. So I think what I have communicated is, whilst this is an extra cost on EV drivers, and the point about equity and those people who don't have driveways is very well made and very much on my mind as well. But for the vast majority, I think the cost of driving electric report came out with 80% of scenarios people would be saving money. And the vast majority of the current EV drivers have a similar profile to John and Rosa. So they will still be saving money, even with this 3p per mile. And I would say also that by the time this legislation comes in, I would hope that there would be other supporting legislation which reduces the cost of public charging, equalises VAT, reduces the standing charges, and also more broadly on reducing the cost of electricity. So I would hope that would also not be penalising those other two. But I think the headline is vast majority of EV drivers will still be better off. There will still be a cost benefit, even with this 3p per mile.
Thanks, Melanie. And Sylvia and Graham. Sylvia, you're campaigning for better transport, and Graham, you're professing on sustainable mobility. Do you both see this development as part of a thumbs up improvement for better transport and sustainable mobility? Or are you at all concerned that this might be, I think I raised it earlier, distracting us somewhat from the wider picture about the place of cars in our transport system? Sylvia, would you like to have a go first, and I'll come to Graham, and then Richard, I'll be back to you.
I think, as others have already said, this is just one small piece of policy that needs to be part of a bigger package of policies that promotes a sustainable transport system. It is necessary to implement a pay-per-mile scheme in order to obviously readjust the pricing signals for electric cars compared to petrol and diesel, compared to public transport. But we also need to be investing much more capital and revenue investment into public transport, into active travel, making sure that people have a wide range of options that are not sort of penalizing them for living in areas with poor public transport options. I know that many people at the moment are locked into transport poverty, into car dependency, simply because they have no choice. If we improve those choices for people, then hopefully they will have those sustainable options they can choose from, alongside an electric vehicle that is cleaner and cheaper to run than petrol and diesel cars that will still be on our roads for decades to come, let's be honest.
Thanks, Sylvia. Graham.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really important point. Where do cars fit into society in the future? And we will be needing them. One of the areas I've written about is the way we're adopting electric vehicles. We currently have a battery arms race where people want more and more range, more and more battery capacity, so they can charge more at home and travel longer distances without having to charge. What we actually want is fairly small batteries, which are cheaper for people to buy, use fewer resources to produce, but that then means they're more reliant on the public charging network. So these things do intersect. So I think a more sustainable electric vehicle is a smaller battery, lower charging capacity vehicle, but that would not be favoured by a scheme which makes public charging more expensive or more difficult. The other side of this could be, what's the impact on car clubs? We've seen the largest player in the UK withdraw. We know that they're going to be included in the London charge now for electric vehicles, which is going to cause a favourability issue. And presumably the 3P is going to be passed on as well to users of those vehicles. So those rates will all go up. So I think the sustainable mobility piece is complex. Clearly, we'd like people to use cars less, but the extent they're going to be using them, we need them to be electric. And so the overall policy context here needs to be promoting sustainable electric car use.
Thanks, Graham. Richard, sorry, I'm throwing you a bit of a wildcard question, but right at the start, we didn't quite mention Venezuela, but we've focused very inwardly, I think, for the most part in our conversation on the UK. Of course, we're in a part of an international landscape, not just with EVs, but more widely. Do you see any international developments that give you cause for concern specifically about this EV development? For example, could this make the UK something of, yet again, showing global leadership on the transitional path, or could it come unstuck because of developments elsewhere?
I'm glad you're not asking me to comment on Venezuela. If we look over our shoulder, we've mentioned Iceland. They introduced this scheme 2 years ago now. It is a very different country, and it'll be harder for us to manage than it is for them. But they introduced it within 12 months. If we successfully introduce this, I think it sets a platform for how we can better influence the wider transport system. So to Graham's point just then, having a pay-per-mile use for vehicles will give us not necessarily control, but an ability to incentivize how people use transport as a whole across the UK, whether it's for the sustainability agenda or whether it's shifting to public transport, whether it's shifting to alternative transport means. So I think if we are to progress this over the next few years and we're to do it successfully, I absolutely think the UK will be seen as setting a tone. Iceland have clearly done it, New Zealand have done it, but I think this will be doing it countrywide at scale, obviously UK is significantly larger than Iceland from a population perspective, I think would be an inordinate success. I also think the challenge that we have between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is a fascinating one. And if we can tackle and solve that one in an appropriate way, then that will also be looked upon by neighbouring countries on how can you do it across between countries. Just one thing to touch on, as I mentioned Iceland and going back to some of the points that were made earlier, I believe the beginning of this week, Iceland introduced their pay-per-mile charge for ICE vehicles as well as electric vehicles. So I'm not saying that that is what would happen for us, because we're seeing it as this is instead of fuel duty. But there is a bit of a precedent being set in Iceland on how they've taken it forwards.
Yeah, very good point. So in a sense, this is the starting line as much as the finishing line, potentially looking forwards. Well, of course, as we knew it would, time has flown by. I'm delighted to see that one of our audience members has commented to the effect that it helped to get them back into work mode for the new year. So we've done a public service, if nothing else, on that front. But I would just like, by way of closing, to give you each sort of another 30 seconds at the mic for your takeaway comments, really, what you would either like to leave the audience with, or what certainly you're taking away for yourselves, possibly that you didn't have before you arrived from this conversation. And if in those 30 seconds you want to make any mention of what you've seen the future to look like in May 2028 after it's been introduced, by all means, be my guest. So Steve, can I come to you first?
Looking back from May 2028, I think the biggest risk is that we thought that this proposal was relatively simple and straightforward, and my God, it turned out to be far more difficult than any of us actually realised. And that's without all the other stuff we hoped it would do.
Thanks, Steve. Anne, well done for staying online for us, sat in your car still charging. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been fascinating to discuss, and I very, very much hope that it doesn't halt the transfer, because we are, as Melanie said, maybe I didn't make clear enough, we are doing really well, but we need to keep going. And I believe in Iceland, adding the price per mile reduced the switch by about 3 to 5%. Someone told me on LinkedIn, so quite significant potentially. And I just very, very much hope that it doesn't do that.
Thank you, Anne. Richard, back to you.
So I think the May 28, I sincerely hope that we have done this successfully. I think we will have introduced a form of what has been put in the consultation. I wonder if some of the nuances and complexities haven't quite been ironed out by that point, but I am hopeful for us introducing this as a solid foundation in a successful way without noise. I think the point being, if we can introduce it without noise, then it has been a success.
Nice way of putting it. Thanks, Richard. Sylvia.
I'm hopeful and optimistic that this is a sensible system, a sensible scheme that will hopefully be introduced without too much controversy. It's something that is necessary, and if we don't manage to make it happen by 2028, then we will have missed the boat for another decade on doing something that is, a similar scheme that addresses transport costs. But we need to be looking at, all the other policies that need to be in place in order to support the EV transition by then.
Thanks, Sylvia. Quite a sobering thought. Just a reminder that the next general election can be called is 2029, and goodness knows what political landscape we'll be facing by then. Graham.
I was just going to make that point. We'll be a year away from a general election. If we still have a tenfold difference in energy costs for the have drives and don't have drives, I think this is politically unfeasible and won't happen. I think when you look at the international examples, you need to look at the differential energy cost. In fact, that's something I would like to be doing this year. I suspect they're nothing like what it is. Public charging much cheaper in places like France and Spain, where this would be less controversial. So if we can't solve that issue somehow, then it's not a political starter.
Thanks, Graham. And lastly, but not least, to you, Melanie.
Thank you. I mean, I think I've definitely learned. I'm really interested in all the other experts and putting it in the context of the wider public transport and sort of sustainable transport framework, which is, because I'm quite focused on electric cars, so that's been really useful. But I do think we've got to keep in mind that this is a really important transition that we're going through, and that messaging, the public are very, very sensitive to different messages. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that there's a lot of power behind negative messaging. So my concern is that this will be yet another negative message. And my hope is that if we do have to, if this does come in play, that it's done in a simple way, and that the government very much holds firm on the bigger policies, which are the ZEV mandate, the 2030 ban on cars solely powered by petrol and diesel, and the 2030 final ban, because the whole industry needs certainty in policy in order to invest, particularly in the charging infrastructure and the associated services.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you all of you for, as someone said in the audience, such an eye-opener to start the year with. And I hope this is food for thought we can now leave on record on YouTube for those who weren't able to make it today. So I'm very grateful for everyone's engagement. And I would say, I think on behalf of you all, the tone of this has been one of constructive challenge. And I hope that will be received in the way intended by those elsewhere in the industry, and indeed government itself, on this difficult journey. Shania, back to you to close off, please.
Yeah. Just wanted to say thank you to everybody that registered. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Glenn for coordinating the idea. If you were interested, if you're not following us already on Eventbrite, please do subscribe, and you'll receive notifications straight to your inbox for our ongoing series. Again, just a reminder about call for papers for the Transport Practitioners meeting that's happening in July this year. It's the first time I've said that, actually. So yeah, if you're interested in submitting an abstract or a workshop idea, please do contact me and I can send you any details. But for now, thanks everybody for joining. The engagement in the chat box was great. Loads of questions and comments coming in. Really appreciate it. So thank you. Until next time. Bye.